Hey, what's up? It's Ben Passmore, obviously. Um, this is new for me. I don't usually pre-record my presentations. I had in mind that I would sort of present a series of sort of like interlocking things that have to do with uh, bottom feeders. This horror comic I did with my friend Ezra Clayton Daniels, who's the writer of it, and within that, sort of explain where I was coming from, just in terms of my point of view in history, which I think is relevant to the book, and hopefully it's not super meandering um, and confusing. Um, yeah, I've done a lot of presentations, so you'd think I would be really good at making them concise. But anyway, um, I guess I will begin in the beginning with an introduction. You already know it's your boy, and if you know me at all, which you may not, outside of knowing that I'm doing this presentation, which is more than fine. But if you know me, it's because I did this comic several years ago called Your Black Friend, which was a short 11-page comic about black alienation, particularly focused on black people within, you know, predominantly white punk subculture, but speaks to sort of broader concepts around that. So it's either that or comic work I do for this website called the Nib, which is a political comics website and also has a regular magazine. But in general, I'm a freelance cartoonist. I do work sometimes for outlets like the New York Times, or more reputable publications like The Believer. Um, in general, I am a political satirist. I do editorial and a bit of history, and something that someone has certainly called journalism. You could certainly argue it one way or the other. And I do it all from a particularly black anarchist perspective. Um, yeah, so something that I usually like to sort of talk about, or clarify is what I mean by political, or the political. Um, Usually, this is to sort of not confuse what people usually mean by political, which is just referring to whatever is happening in government, or not even that, just sort of like mainline policy issues, which are important for here it would be something recent, issues around abortion, all very important, and has to do with the political, has to do with policy. But when I mean political, I mean often small p political, um, and in this case we're talking about coercion. So that my my totally confusing definition that I came up with, even though I'm sure I could have just drawn from some sort of specific theorist. But anyway, it's actions or concepts that engage with forms of force waged by or on an individual or groups. So we're just talking about, yeah, force. Um, so what does that mean for a black anarchist? So, an anarchist perspective in general is one that surveys and critiques hierarchical force in our lives and in society and history in general. Um, I don't worry, I'm not trying to give an overall sort of lecture on anarchism. I am not qualified to do that. I'm just, if you don't know, hopefully by the end you at least have some sense of what I mean when I say the political or black anarchist. Um, so more specifically, just to put a finer point on it, um, an anarchist will be, you know, um, in what is the word? Sort of, an anarchist would be. or tends to be sort of antagonistic towards state structures, capitalism, racism, bigotry in general, is sort of generally pro mutual aid, intersectionality, and solidarity. Um, Sort of there are various sort of approaches to Black anarchism. Specifically, a Black anarchist is not um, merely a Black person that is an anarchist. Um, it's not a modifier, as some would say. It's at least within the context of the United States and parts of Africa, a Black anarchist has a view of Black subjectivity and a particular kind of political sort of thread with that. One contradiction in it is that uh, Black anarchism does potentially see um, advocacy for the Black nation, and nationalism, as I said, is antithetical to anarchism. Although there is a conversation to be had about whether or not there's a nation as a state. But anyway, so this is a contradiction, um, and it sort of speaks to something I'm broadly sort of drawn to, which is just contradictions in general. You know, things, ideas, sort of histories that sort of complicate what we sort of are generally been told, or what I was sort of generally taught about, sort of like the world, where it's like there's good and bad, there's chaos and order, um, and and for me, some of this, like many people, is very based very much in my personal history as being one of the few Black kids in a very small white community, being institutionalized, going through the criminal system, criminal justice system, but also, going to art school, working as an artist for fancy publications. Like I remember having a meeting uh, at a Freedom Tower, um, with the New Yorker magazine, and and the security guards questioning me when I was walking in the building, and a part of me was like, yeah, I don't actually really know what I'm doing here. I don't feel educated or upper class enough to be here. Anyway, I was. Obviously, I believe in myself. Um, so anyway, back to the subject. Um, Basically, I like to make comics about people, usually navigating contradictions, but not necessarily becoming pessimistic or fatalistic as a result. That they still push for personal and collective liberation, even though life is incredibly messy. Um, some of my political consciousness was developed in high school when I was institutionalized, but more specifically towards anarchism in my sort of mid to late 20s, when I spent a lot of time in punk and anarchist circles, or anarcho-punk circles. Anarchy and punk have a long history. They're, not necessarily inclusive, not necessarily sort of exclusive, but generally, in addition to sort of all the antis that a general anarchist would believe in, punks obviously enjoy punk, the music, the fashion, the general culture, and with that culture, at least when I was coming up, it included DIY, riding freight trains and stuff, dumpstering, squatting, certain aspects of illegalism, I would say. Um, and this consequently meant that I was around a lot of pretty alternative white people, um, with various kinds of left politics. Arguably, anarchism is part of the left. I do not include it that way, but there is anarchists and sort of social anarchists and people who are maybe a little more Marxist-y. But these were very white circles that basically just interacted with other white people. But these were in um, very Black cities in the South. So I went to college in Savannah, Georgia, um, and got really into anarchism. there, and then I moved to New Orleans, which is also a majority black city, and was part of the anarchist scene there. And in both these cities are have faced for a long time, massive redevelopment and gentrification and displacement of black populations within them. Um, Something that I noticed pretty quickly, to be honest, was that these really alternative white people who are not from the cities in which we were living in. Um, Existed in a constant contradiction of saying that they believed one thing, among many things, that they were against the wholesale appropriation and displacement of the black population in these cities, but their daily lives reinforce aspects of this process and white supremacy in general. So, the question you're immediately asking yourself is, why was I in these spaces? And that's certainly something that's worth talking about. I mean, for one, to be overly simplistic, the sunken place is a real is a real place. Um, but I think initially, I'm a mixed race person. My mom is white, and I grew up in a pretty white community, and I had always sort of ping ponged between black and white circles. So initially, I was like, oh, here's a place where people um, counter to sort of the circles I was in before won't shame me for a background being very poor and being a criminal. Um, so at first, it seemed like accepting in those ways. But the inherent anti-blackness of the super white anarcho-punk, or just honestly just punk subculture, really started to get to me, and I started addressing it more specifically in my comics. Um, at that time, I was really into historical nonfiction, writing just straight sort of commentary about global politics. Um, but uh, pretty quickly, I felt like I wasn't bringing anything to the medium at all. I wasn't being convincing. I was making like a lot of rah-rah comics for people who already agreed with me. And I also felt like my visual approach to these comics was overly literal, and I got really bored really, really quickly. Um, so I started to play in sort of genres, whether it be, like sci-fi or um, like the Western, or sorts of different things in general, and also with color and just sort of different kinds of visualizations, narrative visualizations, that I hadn't really done before that. It was actually a pretty huge jump. Um, and all of the subject matter tended to center more on the community I was a part of. I'm still in New Orleans, so it would have to do with you know sort of critiques about dynamics at a punk show, or in this comic right here, about I this is was referencing this rich kid whose house I was living in with some other people. Um, so something that I liked about it was that I was commentating about things that were happening in my community, and people would read them, and it would have some sort of like effect, mostly eye rolls, but it felt less abstract than me writing about global politics. So this brings me about to where I started working on bottom feeders with Ezra. Um, I met Ezra. This is a depiction of Ezra, obviously. So I met Ezra, who's the writer of Bottom Feeders, during a festival in Chicago called the Chicago Alternative Comics Expo, or CAKE for short. It was actually my first indie comics convention, as opposed to like the huge comic conventions with like Marvel and DC and I don't know. What's another one? Atomic? No. Um, anyway, you get it. So it was my first indie comic show, and I had seen Ezra. This is actually Ezra, what he looks like. Um, I'd seen Ezra do a reading in Chicago, not in real life. I was scrolling Tumblr, and I came across a video of him doing a comics reading for an event. I think that was called Brain Frame. He can confirm later. Um, and I had at this point had done readings. It was sort of like, especially coming as a punk, but doing an art thing that is not performative, doing sort of comics readings was like a nice way to sort of perform, but also sort of be within the community and not just like in my room doing the thing that I like. Um, but I felt like what I did was pretty basic, was just sort of like clicking through like slides and panels, basically what I'm doing now. But Ezra's included, all sorts of soundscapes and animatics, and it was definitely next level and experimental in these ways that I thought was interesting. Also, things that stood out that maybe stood out to you. He's also a mixed black man, and also at this time, indie comics was like really white, and it was a lot of comics about like white men navel gazing. There was a lot of autobio, people, talking about their day to day in like very small ways. And I think for me that didn't feel particularly subversive, probably in part because it was omnipresent. So Ezra was doing, science fiction, which at the time in the style that was like pretty polished. It didn't look like he had just drawn it straight, no pencils with a micron in the back of a coffee shop. It looked like he paid for Photoshop and shit. So anyway, so I knew him from that, and I was impressed with his work, and also just appreciating another person of color in the in the place. So I gave him a copy of this comic, not this particular comic, but a comic from the series called Dayglow that I started doing, um, to just sort of like, which is definitely a move in indie comics in the US. I don't know about the UK, but trading comics is what you do there at indie comics, because you're certainly not making money. So anyway, and he gave me a copy of a series he was doing that I think was Changers, that I don't think he ever wants to talk about, but that's what he gave me. But anyway, so Dayglow Hole was sort of like, it was a comic series that was basically continuing what I was already doing, which was experimenting with fiction, but like fiction that was speaking to what was happening in my life. Um, so I was using the genre of the post-apocalyptic, or the post-event, which I would put Mad Max, or I was specifically influenced by Escape from New York and L.A., and also A Boy and His Dog. Um, to movies in which a lot of things are bad, but also sort of the world is really over the top. It's like um, almost straight, metaphor. But I was doing this to talk about sort of the gentrifying attitudes that people had about New Orleans at the time. This was only a couple years after Katrina, and there was a lot of people, including the governor and nonprofits and the police, that thought that Katrina had wiped the slate clean in New Orleans, and they could just project sort of their fantasies on to the city, which is not true. Like, there's people who are, you know, who were living their lives in New Orleans and trying to rebuild it, while all these people, punks included, were sort of treating the city like their playgrounds. So let's talk about that, and just sort of things that are generally always relevant, like policing, sort of capitalist attitudes. But also, I wanted to do my own navel gazing and talk about my own mental health and issues with my dad and stuff. So it was all sort of um, a gumbo, you would say, of subject matter. Um, so a year after I met Ezra, I was at Cake again, and I was sort of on my way out of comics, going to festivals from the Deep South because there wasn't really any festivals at the Deep South in the Deep South at this time. There still kind of isn't. So I was pretty isolated from sort of the indie comics community. It was expensive to to get out to these festivals, and it was really hard to get my books into stores. I would have to, mail them to individual stores, and they'd be like, okay, well, we can't buy them. We'll do it for consignment. And then I have to remember to message them, or call every couple months to see if they sold the three comics that I sent them. So it was incredibly inefficient, and basically no stores even want to do that. So I was like, okay, I like to draw and do comics, but maybe this is not like, something I should spend the majority of my time on. Um, but I ran into Ezra at Cake, and he asked me if I wanted to work on this comic with him that was about an apartment that eats people in Chicago. Um, and prior to that, I had done work for hire stuff before. I had done, done the art for people's stories that they had written. But this comic, that after Ezra sort of explained finer points to it, seemed to be more in line with the kind of comics I like to make. It was using genre to talk about sort of big ideas, gentrification in specific, but also talk about the sort of nuances of the different kinds of people that are sort of involved in this kind of dynamic. So the comic, general premise follows Darla, who is an upper middle class, maybe even upper class black art school graduate that moves to an impoverished black neighborhood in Chicago that's in the early stages of redevelopment in order to grab onto some like authenticity. Her family was originally from this neighborhood, but she did not grow up here. Um, and also she needs, like a cheap place to work to get her fashion line off the ground. Um, as I said, I'm a mixed black man. I went to art school. I related to her sort of dual position of both being the subject of oppression and also indirectly contributing to the cultural extraction of a black neighborhood by, white society, white sort of, um, white sort of economic actors individually. Um, and it's sort of in the book, Darla has conflicts with her white friend that she grew up with, who's very close to her, but is using Darla's new address and sort of Darla's story in general to sort of like reinforce her own identity of like sort of like hip woke white person. And Darla comes into conflicts with her, potential employers and her landlord, the white man who owns this building and is trying to get, artsy types and probably eventually, white tech entrepreneurs into the warehouse after she kicks Darla out in a year or so. Um, so it's it's speaking to sort of like, you know, um, people who have a close proximity to white culture, um, but also have a complicity to appropriation. And and I think something that is important because this can sound like it's sort of doing like a both sides of it. It's some sort of like weird centrism around gentrification. That's not what I'm saying. I think something that I liked about the book was that gentrification, just like late capitalism in general, um, we sort of exist on different poles, but we're all sort of eaten up by it. Not to the same extent. There's plenty of people who are, experiencing the alienation of existing under capitalism, but they're experiencing that alienation on a yacht. But I liked that this book was sort of talking about the sort of contradictions. And, as I said before, I'm drawn to that, And I think, just sort of the politic that guides my life, thrives in sort of viewing these contradictions as a necessary part of analyzing how we live. Um, so I hadn't done any horror comics at this point, really. I had, covered dark subjects. I had, had weird monsters in my, post-apocalyptic comics. I mean, you kind of have to have weird mutants and stuff if you're gonna, write about the end of the world. Um, my 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 sort of lack of having horror tools meant that I feel like I had two choices, either to sort of replicate, um, become a fast study for horror and replicate sort of tools that I picked up from like Junji Ito or something, who I liked and who me and Ezra looked at quite a bit, or I was the other choice was just to try and make something that I thought was horrifying in a way that was fairly uniquely my own. Um, my style is deeply informed by 90s superhero comics. I would make fun of Rob Liefeld now, but back then when I was a kid, I was super into it. So lots of over the top framings and compositions. But also, I was I'm an art school graduate of a particular time, so I was really into 60s underground comics. And while I don't think that I care about the majority of those comics now, although Greg Irons is still really good and as far as I know, not horribly problematic. But anyway, so in general, I went for plasticity and dynamism, and I used a lot of what I would call like comics iconography, motion lines and all sorts of weird punctuations. So Ezra wanted to have, he didn't want to roll that stuff back, but we had a conversation about sort of like visual, um, what is the word? He wanted to sort of like slow things down. He wanted me to pull back and do something that I would think of is sort of like framings that's a bit more sort of analogous to like movie and cinema and stuff. So even though I still continue to draw really cartoony, there was an idea that people should still seem grounded, which I think helps sort of ground the eventual violence and danger. um, he also suggested, and this is just like a total tangent in some ways, but sort of makes ended up making a big difference in terms of what the book looks like. So initially, he wanted to have the inside of the book, the pages be gray tone. And I thought initially, and this was a misapprehension on my part, but I thought that if we just did a limited palette, it'd be the same amount of work. Um, but you would have color, and I love color. That ended up not being true. It was way harder to do it than I initially thought. But I was excited because I was already working in limited palettes, non-literal coloring, um, and sort of playing with that stuff. So just for the sake of, whoever is not familiar with these terms or sort of these concepts, even though I think they're self-explanatory, a limited palette is literally what it sounds like. A palette, a series of colors that you're using, but that grouping is very small. So for me, especially, I think I can get away with this because of how cartoony my style is. I will use, six colors. In some cases, with bottom feeders, there will be like three or four. Um, and you sort of determine what these colors are in the same way you determine, any sort of color scheme. Get your color wheel out and follow one of these, some sort of, complementary rules. And these are four that were applied to bottom feeders. Very, very, very basic. Although I really love analogous plus one complementary myself. Um, So, non-literal coloring, if this is a term that is new to you, that's understandable. It is not, as far as I know, a term that exists within color theory. And I'm sure there's the one exists, but much like the definition, I wasn't able to find it within the first 10 minutes of searching around. So I came up with my own definition. But anyway, it's prioritizing mood, temperature, or tone over straight representation. And the easy way to say this is that rather than a tree's trunk being brown and the leaves being green, we're making decisions based off of like, oh, what is the colors based on being spooky? Um, how is it, what time of day is it? Is it hot? Like, so you might make the decision to make the whole image red or something. Um, very very bog standard, but it's something that I got into. Um, so the the limited palette and the non-literal coloring, if you have three colors that you're trying to make a whole book with, you have to sort of think about how flexible these colors can be and the different things that they could represent. And one sort of visual sort of abstraction or sort of trick that you can use is simultaneous contrast. This is a color theory term, and it just describes colors' tendency to change hue, value, or intensity when placed next to different colors. Which here's a line of colors in which that sort of bears out a little bit. And this is something that you, in terms of maybe not colors, but maybe even just grays or something that you're familiar with. Like you already know, and just sort of inherently that a light color appears lighter on a darker background as opposed to one that is sort of like a midtone or something. So it's sort of similar to that. Um, so Ezra, so just back to the book itself. Ezra had created a floor plan for the building that the majority of the book takes place in. Um, and he'd crafted the outside. So this design where it looks sort of like a what would you say, like a Verizon building or something maybe, or a weird factory. He had already made the outside of. So I wanted the inside to resemble the outside in sort of it being just seemingly made almost entirely out of poured concrete. Um, and I wanted it to sort of all seem, yeah, more factory-like or more machine-like than an apartment that anyone would live in. Um, with both the architecture and the color, I want to replicate the inherent in and how to. I want to replicate the inherent in and Why am I having such a hard? Hold on, let me drink more coffee. I feel like that's the issue. Okay, sorry, I'm just not realizing. I just sipped real hard in your ear. Anyway, basically, I wanted to replicate sort of like the seeming unlivability or some unnaturalness of just like any hood that Black people have been expected to live in. Um, uh, Both because I thought it would add to the tension of the story and give it a distinct visual style, but also it tried to speak to sort of like the general reality of Black life historically in the United States. Um, you know, Ever since arguably since emancipation, but also like the what is called the second great migration, basically Black people moving to the West Coast and the East Coast and the Midwest in the United States. During World War II, Black people were, couldn't live anywhere. They were forced out of most places except for the places that white people didn't want to live. And this was almost always in just deeply inhospitable places. And they, figured out how to thrive anyway. But, I think one of the longstanding traumas is Black people just sort of living in places and expected to sort of feel at home in places that are legally and naturally and economically crafted for them not to thrive in. To contrast that, I kept the neighborhood is not necessarily a very specific neighborhood in Chicago. It's a composite of different, you know, places in the south side of Chicago. But I want it to look basically just normal, corner stores, sidewalks, yada, yada, yada. Um, the color also, in addition to sort of being trying to be unique and trying to replicate a sort of lack of naturalness, I because of the way that the building is designed, it's weird poured concrete. I wanted people to not really get lost. So, like the hallways are a green and the apartment rooms are yellow. This observation deck slash attic is purple, as well as the basement is blue. So I wanted, as particularly as the action picks up, for you to sort of have a sense of where you are, or at least you're in sort of a different places as the characters are moving around. Um, and also just very standard comic stuff. Red is there to let you know that bad shit is happening. um here's just another example of it. Very proud of just the massive tentacles that took forever. So anyway, me and Ezra, we had sort of like a comics retreat, and we can certainly talk more about that when me and Ezra are doing a little Q&A or whatever. But I flew out to Los Angeles to stay with him and his partner, and we, spent a bunch of weeks sort of going over, what monsters would look like and characters and sort of and also just sort of the general, visuals of the comic itself. Um, and then when I got home, I felt like I had a pretty good idea about like what he wanted and sort of what he was, what he thought I could bring to it. And he just sent me the script. And when I would get the script, I think because Ezra, and he can confirm this, I originally imagined Bottom Feeders to be a movie. What I got was a movie script. So there wasn't a panel breakdown, or I think a page one either, maybe. So it was the first thing I needed to do was to do panel breakdowns, and make the pacing and sort of action work, specifically for comics, which was very easy, as there's a cartoonist. So it was a lot of the pacing was sort of uh, pretty intuitive. Anyway, so I was working on that. This is a little sidebar that doesn't speak to uh, necessarily any of the themes within the book, or the inherent politic, but I just think is interesting. So at the time, I was still drawing on paper, huge 11 by 17 sheets of Bristol board. I now draw on an iPad. I do that for everything, but whatever. I was a super legit indie cartoonist, so I was drawing on paper with a brush at the time. And Ezra wanted to make bottom feeders. It's sort of like an app that so you could read through it. On your phone, like he had done with this, what is now actually also a graphic novel, but started off as an app, Upgrade Soul, and it included sort of animatics and effects and music and stuff. So he wanted like the foreground and background to be on different layers, as well as like like whatever what might be like a tentacle or some like goo or something also be on its own thing, which is fine. But so I had to have each of these layers on a different piece of paper. So I was penciling and inking on a light box, which is not unusual for a cartoonist at all necessarily. The extra wrinkle was that I lived in a squat that ran off of solar power at the time. Um, and it was not a huge system. It was just like six car batteries looped together and attached to a solar panel that was maybe the size of like a pretty standard like school desk. I think, like the top of the desk in this picture. So if I was running my scanner and light box, not even all day, but just for a couple hours, I would have taken all the power that me and my housemates used to do whatever we needed to do. Particularly in the summer, uh, we needed the fans to combat the constant mosquitoes and just aggressive heat of Louisiana. So a lot of bottom feeders, particularly in the beginning, was drawn in coffee shops and in this Royal. I think it's called like the Royal Knights Hotel on Airline Highway near the airport in New Orleans. I would go and create an impromptu studio in this motel and just pull just wild all-nighters, um, trying to use all the electricity. In general, it was a fun experience as it was really hands off. But even though Ezra gave me just a lot of flexibility to do um, to make it look the way I wanted to make, it was still, it's still a challenge as someone who considers themselves like a writer artist, like I like to make comics in a very sort of specific way. Um, and something that was nice is that it did feel like Ezra, I think he even said this, that, he did, do the most recent draft of Bottom Feeders sort of like with my own comics in mind, which was unique. Prior writers had just sort of written things how they wanted, and were just sort of expecting me to be a printer. And of course, it was very different um, working with a peer who was pretty familiar with my comics already. Um, in general, I think collaborating requires compromising for a shared vision and respecting someone enough to let them sort of guide you through something. And I think in this case, just having a lot of mutual respect meant that it was very easy for us to sort of trust each other's vision. And hopefully by the end, you create something brand new that can't really exist without the other person. Sort of, like all healthy relationships. Without spoiling the ending of the book sort of resolves without trying to resolve anything, per se when it comes to sort of gentrification or, capitalism, or particularly sort of like racial capitalism. Um, as things about the building and the people's lives in it are revealed, the battle lines of appropriation become more complex. They don't, the beneficiaries and the antagonists don't necessarily change because those are pretty well defined and historical. Um, but like who we consider an antagonist and a protagonist sort of shift, and also just like the history of the monster itself, and also what it means to be monstrous, what it sort of means to be sort of considered um, sort of like a danger. Um, and and sort of within that, you can write something like that, and in the end have your have forget it's Chinatown moment, which I think is super pessimistic, and also pessimistic in what I think I would consider just like a hyper masculine way. It's like, well, nothing matters. We're just gonna shake our head at the way of the world and sort of be sort of overly essentialist about like how everything is dark and then justify our indifference. But this is neither pessimistic nor engages in toxic positivity about the future either. It doesn't say like we'll beat this. This is how blah blah blah. Um, in the book, some things, actually most things about Darla's world don't change. But I think for the character and the reader considering the issue of gentrification, there's a lot of possibility within self-honesty. The sort of the what has been part of the discourse of gentrification has been a really huge emphasis on history and economics and sort of understanding the issues, quote unquote. And that is all very, very important. But I think also there's a lack of sort of realness about how we specifically contribute to displacement. White people, certainly that's a pretty common sort of conversation about where responsibility is, but also how things like, black capitalism contribute to the displacement of black communities as well. Um, all that being said, I tried to think about a dope final point about how this all applies to collaboration, and maybe there was some ideas in my head about referring to the constant interplay between the reader and the artist, and had self-honesty and transparency being sort of a part of that. Um, I have to be honest, I couldn't really think of something that really popped, and in part that's because Ezra didn't write this presentation. You just have the chaos of my mind. So I guess blame Ezra. Let's start a petition to have Ezra write my presentations. But that being said, thank you so much for your time, and I hope this was slightly enjoyable. I think that I probably could hear every single time Ezra rolled his eyes watching this. Um, so yeah, thanks for your time.